The year was 1875, and it was a warm August morning when a discovery was made. A 100-t-long schooner named the Rosabelle was found floating upside down just 40 miles away from Milwaukee. A team quickly rushed to the ship, concerned that the crew may still be alive and in grave danger, but there was no trace of them all. 10 men who were on board when the ship set sail across Lake Michigan were gone. The ship was virtually undamaged. The weather had been clear on the day it had set out. No trace of the crew could be found in the surrounding waters. It was like they had just vanished. No one could figure out what had caused the incident to happen. The prevailing theory was they had been involved in some kind of collision, but the Coast Guard determined this could not have been the case. Some suggested that maybe it ran into a storm further east, but this also appears to be disputed. The Rosabelle was in such good condition still, and filled with its lumber supplies that it had left with, so it was simply righted up and towed back to the docks. Soon enough it was back in service as if nothing had ever happened. The 30th of October 1921, after the tragedy that had happened nearly 50 years earlier, the Rosabelle had become a common sight on the waters of Lake Michigan and had no further issues. That was until this day. Captain Ed Joe Johnson apparently awoke from his sleep in a startled way. He had just experienced a terrible nightmare. He was due to command the ship, but in his dream, he had seen a terrible end for the Rosabelle. Something about the dream genuinely shook him. This wasn't just pre-expedition jitters. He genuinely believed it was a premonition of Sal's, so much so that he refused to step foot on the boat. The following day, the Rosabelle was found yet again upside down. This time there was damage to the ship, but no collision was reported, and no one discovered the other ship that may have crashed into it. And also, in an eerily familiar situation, no sign of its crew could be found. A tragic, but completely plausible nautical coincidence, right? But maybe not. When you consider the horrifying legends of Lake Michigan, get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights, and get comfortable. It's been a little while since we delved into a place of high strangeness, from haunted lighthouses to ghost ships, disappearing people to disasters in both the sea and the air, and of course, one of the most widely reported UFO sightings of all time. The dark secrets of Lake Michigan has it all. Welcome to the tape library. For those who might not be familiar, to call Lake Michigan a lake might be technically correct, but doesn't do justice to its scale. This is one of the 5 Great Lakes of North America, spanning over 22,000 square miles. 4 separate states run along its shorelines, and it had been a key trading route for many ships for hundreds of years. It can be an unforgiving place to sail, especially back then, but the sheer number of ships the lake has claimed over the years is astonishing. To get into the various disasters that have taken place would take hours. But let's talk about some of the more notable ones. Numerous ships have gone missing on Lake Michigan. The problem is, in some cases, people keep seeing them. The Griffin is often cited as the first ship to fall prey to the curse of Lake Michigan, weighing 45 tons. The ship was constructed in Lake Erie in 1,679 August of that year. The ship set sail for Green Bay. It had just loaded up with furs there and was then headed to Niagara, but it never made it there, and no trace of the ship or its crew was ever found. Rumors have, of course, circulated around the years. Reports from a lighthouse keeper were discovered who claimed he had found a group of skeletons huddled together in a cave off of the lake that he believed could have been the crew of the Griffin. And there is also the story that a group of Native Americans stumbled across the ship's crew and warned them that they were heading into a particularly nasty storm. The captain of the ship ignored the tribe's warnings and sailed off into it anyway, never to be seen again. There were also accusations of mutiny of the crew turning on their captain to keep the precious furs for themselves, but if this were true, none of those men ever seemed to resurface in the area. But over the centuries that have passed, many sailors have reported seeing a ship that matches the description of the Griffin moving across the waters late at night. Some have even gone as far to say that when they attempted to approach the ship, it simply vanished. The Griffin is far from the only ship to have met a deadly face on the waters of Lake Michigan, and it is also far from the only one that is reported as being seen. Again, one such ship was the Chakur, a 2,117-foot-long wooden steamer that went missing in 1895. Remnants of the ship were discovered, and even a couple of messages in bottles washed up on beaches, apparently telling of difficulties the ship was having, but once again the full wreckage was not found, and neither were any of its crew, a fantastically strange detail too. This ship's story was that much like the captain of the Rosabelle, the captain had concerns about the trip that day due to a bad omen that involved the ship's clerk, James R. Clark, who had apparently been with a friend who had shot a duck that had landed on the ship, something that was seen as an act that could cause bad luck. Simple superstition, of course, but maybe the death of that duck led to not only the tragic end of the ship, but maybe it is to blame for the fact that Chakur is another ship that is reported as being seen silently gliding across the lake in the years that followed its disappearance. It appears, however, these phantom ships are not just echoes of a tragic past playing out. Some have reported interacting not just with the ships, but more disturbingly, with the crews on board. At some point in the 1992nd, a small group of weekend sailors had taken their sailboat out for an afternoon trip just outside of St. Joseph in Michigan. They were caught off guard when a fog bank rolled into the area, dropping their visibility considerably. Then their engine conked out. The group quickly jumped on the radio to get help from the Coast Guard, but no response appeared to be coming through. The group of friends quickly became concerned what was going on. How had their innocent day of fun turned south so quickly? But rescue Sly came out of the thick mist. A second sailboat came into view. Pulling up alongside them, the crew of the second ship quickly took the group on board and attached a tow line to their ship with the intention of taking them to St. Joseph. As they progressed along the way, the crew of the second ship told the friends of the dangers of the lake, how so many people had been caught out by unexpected weather changes over the years, and how lucky they were to have found them before anything happened. But then their behavior turned a little strange. They instructed the group of friends to get back onto their ship just before they reached St. Joseph, and then they disconnected the tow line and disappeared back off into the fog. The friends were perplexed. They were close enough to St. Joseph now, and out of the fog, far enough that they believed someone else could help them the rest of the way. But as they shouted out to the other ship, it was like the crew totally ignored them. Suddenly the Coast Guard showed up. They had actually received a distress call, but the group's radio, for some reason, hadn't allowed them to hear the Coast Guard's response. The Coast Guard had been out searching in the fog for the ship and were relieved to find them. They had been tracking them on their radar, which gave them a 24-meter radius to search. The Coast Guard towed them back to the St. Joseph port, and the two couples on board were relieved to be back on dry land. That was when they asked the Coast Guard about the other ship. The Coast Guard was confused. No other ship had been on their radar, and it did not show up when they saw the group's boat moving back towards St. Joseph. It was only when they spread the story around the area that a crew member on another ship claimed that their description of the boat that had come to rescue them sounded a lot like another that had been lost at sea 10 years prior. It's not just the waters themselves that seem to be teeming with ghost stories. The communities that surround Lake Michigan are filled with countless supernatural goings-on, from bars and restaurants to hotels and parks. The many islands that litter the lake all seem to have their own creepy tales too. Lake Michigan is also home to over 100 lighthouses, and of course it is said that every lighthouse has a ghost story. The Fisher Lighthouse is seemingly the most widely documented of these haunted towers, apparently the home of the ghost of a lighthouse keeper by the name of Captain Townsend, who was born in Crystal before becoming a lighthouse keeper in the United States. He apparently died in painful circumstances, although I was unable to get clarity on what those circumstances were. The Historical Society, who now cares for the lighthouse, believed there are actually 5 different spirits residing there, built in 1895. The lighthouse has a long history of keeping the sailors of Lake Michigan safe. The paranormal activity first began to be reported, though in 1980, 8 inmates of a local prison were tasked with helping restore the lighthouse to its former glory, but very quickly, several of them refused to go up to the upstairs of the lighthouse alone, claiming that they believed that something was up there. Months later, a carpenter who was working up there alone stopped suddenly when he heard the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway behind where he was working. He went to investigate, but found no one else in the building. He went back to work, and the footsteps started up again. Again, he claimed he distinctly heard them head towards the staircase and begin to walk down them once again. He looked with a clear view down the staircase from where he was standing. He could see they were totally empty. This was enough for the carpenter, who quickly grabbed his tools and left, refusing to return. This was just a start, and since then hundreds of reports have been made about strange activity in the lighthouse, some of the most common of which are people seeing faces form in a mirror upstairs, the smell of cigar smoke appearing and disappearing out of nowhere, and the apparition of a woman being seen in the window looking down at the waters below. In 1997, a documentary crew visiting the lighthouse to document the restoration all claimed to have encountered strange activity, seeing apparitions, hearing strange sounds and witnessing items move when no one was around, including cutlery being placed in an appropriately formal setting at the table. Meanwhile, over on Chambers Island, a lighthouse keeper would report that when he would come to the house in spring to take over the duties, there would be someone else there from 1976 until he left his post. 10 years later, lighthouse keeper Joel Blank claimed that on the first night he would arrive in the lighthouse, he would always be awoken by the sound of footsteps loudly feuding down the lighthouse steps. He would often hear them marching all the way down before then hearing the eerie sound of the back door latch clicking open as though it were leaving, having kept watch over the lighthouse for the winter. In later years, others reported strange incidents, mostly items going missing and turning up in unusual places. The stories of the Chambers Island ghosts quickly spread and became part of the tour guide's tales of the place. When a group of nuns were visiting the island, they heard the story of the ghost. One nun, seemingly genuinely affected by the recounting, headed to the side of the lighthouse and began to pray. No reports of Paran activity have apparently been made since that day. 1987 Rock Island has its fair share of terrifying stories as well. Long-time listeners of the show may recall I featured a personal account of one camper's experience. Is there? If you haven't heard that one, I'll link it below. Then there is St. Martin Island, which has a tragic little tale that is the perfect primer for a ghost story. The story goes that the ghost of the St. Martin Island lighthouse is a former keeper. The keeper's children attended a school at nearby Washington Island, and they would travel by boat to and from the school each day. But one day the boat didn't make it back. All his children were lost at sea, never to be found. The keeper searched the shoreline for days, distraught, desperately searching for any sign of his children waving the green light of his lantern. As he did, the story then goes on that one night a schooner was traveling through the area when the lighthouse light unexpectedly went out. Terrified that they were about to hit the hazardous rocks around the island, boat's crew were relieved when they noticed that a green lantern was being held up on the shore, providing just enough context for how far away they were. The light flickered in the wind, and the crew were sure of it. Someone was trying to help them. They jumped into the sea, moving through the water until they reached the shore, leaving the ship until morning. But as they approached the light bobbed off further into the island. Assuming it was leading them to a safe place, they followed it. Through the darkness, it suddenly vanished. But then they noticed another light source. It was the open door to the lighthouse, keeper's heart light, streaming out onto the ground. They walked inside and saw the lantern they had followed. Left on a table next to it lay the frozen dead body of the lighthouse keeper. Entire crews have gone missing on the waters of Lake Michigan, but some of the stranger stories refer to the disappearance of individuals. There are two examples of missing ship captains that I found super interesting. The 28th of April 1937, Captain George Ardonna was leading the O.M. McFarland across the northern waters of Lake Michigan. It was just after 10 p.m. that night when Captain Donner told his second mate he was going to get some rest. He asked his second mate to wake him when they were close to Port Washington, which he anticipated they would reach within about 3 hours as the ship cut through the icy spring waters. The second mate heard the captain go into the room next door and claimed he thought he was going through his paperwork, assuming he was getting something ready that he would need for when they arrived in port. Later that night, before retiring to his cabin, 3 hours later, the second mate knocked on the captain's door, but there was no answer. He knocked again. Silence. He attempted to open the captain's quarters, but the door was locked from the inside. He went to get the master key and returned to find something unusual. The room was empty. The crew searched the entire ship, but no sign of the captain could be found. In October of 1987, a very similar incident happened. Captain Frederick Healing told his crew he would be heading to his quarters at 2 a.m. to get some much-needed rest, requesting they wake him up at 8 a.m. When the crew went to wake him, the captain was nowhere to be found. The Coast Guard searched 900 square miles of the lake and found no sign of the man. The FBI even got involved interviewing everyone on the ship, concerned that foul play may have taken place, but they decided there were no leads to follow up on. The captain was just gone. But it's not just people on the water who have suffered unusual disappearances. There is, of course, the story of Stephen Kubacki. In February of 1978, Stephen Kubacki, a student at a nearby institution, vanished. He had set out alone on a brief cross-country skiing trip around Lake Michigan, one that should have lasted no more than a day or two, but he didn't return. A line of footprints in the snow, stretching roughly 200 yards, traced his path to the lake's edge, and then without further sign or trace the trail just ended. Authorities, finding no other clues, concluded that he must have slipped beneath the lake's frozen surface, lost under a thick layer of unbroken ice. Although they could find no evidence of this either. A local news report from the 21st of February described snowmobilers finding a set of abandoned cross-country skis and a backpack, prompting them to alert authorities. Kubacki was known as an avid outdoorsman, someone who had braved mountain summits while studying abroad in Europe. Cross-country skiing in the chilly, windswept expanses along Lake Michigan was familiar territory for him. There was little unusual about his plans for broad-gromming bents. Plans. That winter weekend, the authorities were baffled, and his family had to deal with the fact that they did not know for certain what had happened to him. But then on May 5th, 1979, more than 14 months after he first disappeared, Key woke up in a field in Pittsville, Massachusetts, 700 meters east of the spot where his footprints had vanished. He had no memory of the 14.5 months he had been missing, and didn't even immediately realize how much time had passed until he picked up a newspaper and saw the date. Disorientated, he made his way to his aunt's house in nearby Great Barrington, just 20 miles away from there. He was reunited with his family when he reappeared. Kubacki told reporters he was wearing clothes that he didn't recognize. He had a backpack containing maps and signs for hitchhiking, hinting that he had traveled widely. By looking through all this stuff, he realized he had been to places like Sacramento, San Francisco, Reno, Chicago, and Utah. He was carrying $40 in cash. He had a new pair of glasses, sneakers, and a t-shirt from a Wisconsin marathon. In an interview he gave after his return, he did suggest that his body HT, and it felt like he had done a lot of running, suggesting that he may have even taken part in the marathon during this time. His memory remained intact right up until that last day on the lake's edge. He remembered feeling cold and afraid as the frozen darkness closed in. He believes his blackout may have stemmed from exhaustion and exposure, and he planned to see a medical doctor for a checkup. However, he maintained that he was in sound mental health when he began his ski trip, and still was. Later that year, he expressed the desire to retrace his steps and uncover the path he had traveled during those lost months, hoping to solve the mystery of where he had been in recent years. He has set up a website and claims is planning to publish a book on what's happened to him, seemingly suggesting he has managed to restore his memory of those 14 months at least. Partially, but so far he has not publicly said what may have happened, and no date for the completion of this book seems to have been posted. Hopefully this is a mystery we can revisit at a later date. Even the sky over Lake Michigan isn't safe. Numerous aircraft have gone dark while flying over the lake. Some have been found as wreckages in the water, others just seem to drop off the face of the earth. The most famous of these incidents is the fate of Flight 2501-inch 1950, a DC-4 airplane, was flying over Battle Creek, Michigan a little before midnight on the 21st of June. On board was a crew of 355 passengers, cruising at an altitude of 3,500 foot. The captain was acutely aware of the thunderstorms that were raging over Lake Michigan, adjusting his flight plan to avoid them. Around 20 minutes later, the captain got back into contact with air traffic control, requesting to drop to 2,500 foot, but due to other aircraft in the area, his request was denied. Whatever happened next happened fast. Numerous witnesses on the ground reported seeing a quick flash of light in the sky. Around this time, Flight 2501 was never heard from again. Over the next few days, small parts of the plane wreckage washed up on the shores around the area, along with parts of people, but it was noted they were all very small parts. Many of the human remains were collected and buried in unofficial unmarked graves around St. Joseph. The full wreckage of the plane was never located, and the cause of the accident, which at the time was the worst commercial airline disaster in America, has never been determined. Around the time the Coast Guard began their IAL search at 2 a.m. On the 24th of June, 2 policemen reported seeing an odd red light hovering over the lake before disappearing off into the dark of the night sky. They would not be alone. Countless stories of strange flying objects have been reported over the dark lake throughout the years, from falling fireballs to flying discs. But before we get into one of the most famous of those sightings, there is one other strange phenomenon that has been reported within the FIAM. The lake that some have suggested may be connected for a number of years. Around the turn of the 20th century, numerous people reported that the water would be seen boiling. A short newspaper article from 1899 reported that in June of that year, a patch of water out by the Bay of Traverse City was seen boiling for a short while, before a great geyser of water bolted upwards to the sky, before falling back down, and the water returning to a calm lapping. In 1902, a fisherman drowned in the area. Many claimed he had become a victim of the boiling water. This strange phenomena was reported on and off until 1917. That year, a Navy ship came into port. The captain of the ship claimed they were there to tow away a confiscated tugboat, but it would be in the city for a couple of days. When a local reporter asked them why, the captain was very evasive, sensing something strange was afoot. The newspaper sent out a couple of reporters to keep an eye on the Navy ship that night. It was anchored at the exact spot that numerous people had reported the boiling water and the strange sights of water shooting up into the sky. 2 divers were spotted jumping into the sea in the middle of the night, while the deck of the ship bustled with activity. They were only in the water for a short while before coming back up to the ship. The reporters said they couldn't see that they had brought anything back up with them. The Navy ship then quickly left. No reports of the boiling water were ever made again. It was the 4th of March, 1994, a clear night in Grand Haven, Michigan. It was around 9 p.m., and Cindy Prada was sitting on the phone in her kitchen talking to a close friend. Her husband was sat in the basement alone, watching television. Cindy's attention was suddenly caught by a light coming through her kitchen window. It seemed to illuminate the entire room. She thought it must have been a huge full moon that night and went to the window to take a look, but when she looked out into the night sky, she didn't see the moon shining back at her. Instead, she saw 4 lights all in a straight line. None of them were moving. They were just there, just above the tree line of her back. Garden Cindy stared at the lights, unsure what she was looking at, when suddenly the one on the far left seemed to glide over the tree line before slowly moving back into the formation of the straight line. Then the light on the far right slowly moved away from the rest before zipping off into the distance in a flash. Now Cindy was really baffled. What could move like that? The lights were so bright that she couldn't see anything behind them, just the light so bright that it penetrated her home. She apparently stayed on the phone with her friend, describing what she was seeing for half an hour, but didn't own a camera, so never got a picture. She did note, though, that the light, if it were an aircraft of some kind, strangely did not make a sound. In fact, it was so quiet out that her horse was stood just below them, calmly grazing like nothing was going on further south in Holland. Graves' family had settled in for an early night. The family consisted of Holly and Darrell Graves, their 1 4-year-old son Joey, and a 1 0-year-old daughter. Joey was the first one to notice it. He and his sister had fallen asleep on the sofas in the living room. The parents had retreated to their bedroom. Joey was awoken by a bright light coming through the windows of their home. Holly was awoken by the sounds of her son screaming for them to come into the living room. When she did, said it was like a spotlight was being shined on their home. After looking outside, Holly called 911, telling them that there was strange flickering lights in the sky and asking if anyone else had reported it at the time. The police said no, this was the first they had heard of it, but they reluctantly agreed to send an officer over to take a look. Holly and Dahl headed outside to try and get a better look themselves. They could see a shape of sorts behind the light, like a cylinder, and they said it looked like it was made of chrome. It just silently glided across the sky slowly, almost like a blimp. It appeared to have no windows and a circle of flickering lights on the bottom. Holly turned to her husband, asking what it was they were looking at. Daryl replied strangely in a calm manner that it was a UFO. The couple stood outside, staring at the object for 20 minutes, until Officer Jerry Fu arrived on the scene at 9:43 p.m. He himself stated that he didn't believe in UFOs. He arrived on the scene expecting this to be a prank or that maybe someone had started a fire, but then he saw it with his own eyes. He saw two lights moving to the southwest of the Graves property. The two lights were close together and seemed to be flashing from white to green. He then said that one light quickly peeled off from the other, moving further south at an incredible speed. They watched for the next 10 minutes, until Officer Veldhaus decided to head back to the radio in his vehicle, unsure what he should do in a situation like this as he walked away. Daryl Graves let out a yell. Officer Veldhaus turned back to see that the remaining light had suddenly split into 5 different lights, all of which shot off into different directions. He jumped in his car and began following the lights as they traveled across the Michigan sky, all the while the sounds of more and more reports being made by concerned citizens carried over the airwaves of his radio. Some people were reporting the lights moving in a straight line together. Others were saying they were making strange movements, joining up with one another before almost jumping across the sky. At this point, around 60 different reports of the lights had come through, so the police decided to contact the radio operator at the Mosin National Weather Station. The man who was on shift that night monitoring the weather was Jack Bushong. When the police told Jack what they were being contacted about, he assumed it was just a mistake, unaware of quite how many witnesses were beginning to filter through, but he was happy to help, so took a look at the radar over the Lake Michigan area. What he saw he couldn't really explain. It appeared that there was something fairly large moving around 60 foot up in the air and traveling about 100 miles per hour, moving in a southwest direction, which seemed to match up with many of the reports. For about 15 seconds, the object seemed to stop hovering in place, which Jack admitted to the police radio operator was unusual to say the least. The object then seemed to jump up to 12 foot in an instant. Jack assumed this too must be some sort of mistake. But then he began to notice multiple objects on the radar. They would come together into a sort of formation before jumping apart again. He could see 3 of these large objects now. They showed up like they were aircraft, but didn't seem to act like them. An officer on the ground was able to confirm the triangular formation that Jack was seeing on the radar. The object to the north would jump, 20-mile hover for a few seconds, then the 2 lower objects would copy the movement. They would then remain in the triangle formation for a few moments before the pattern of movement would repeat again, moving toward Chicago, across Lake Michigan. Once the objects reached a certain area of the lake, they seemed to stop. It was noted that this was the northernmost part of the lake that wasn't currently covered by ice. Jack remained eyes peeled to the radar for the next couple of hours. He claimed he saw dozens of these objects heading to the same location from all different directions, and that they appear to be able to move up and down by thousands of feet in just seconds, until one by one the objects all vanish from the radar at around 2 a.m. When the next technician came to the station to take over, Jack excitedly told him what he had seen, but the technician didn't seem to be all that enthusiastic about it. The following morning, the Mosin Chronicle began receiving phone calls from as early as 8 a.m., with people reporting what they had seen the night before, including 2 pilots who were flying over the lake and claimed to see the bright lights in the sky, which they realized were coming from a cylindrical object that traveled at insane a speed. Although due to the stigma within the commercial airliner community regarding UFO sightings, they asked not to be named. Reporter Michael Walsh contacted the 911 dispatch operator and asked if he could get a copy of the 911 calls they had received the night before, and when he heard them, he was blown away. Some sounded terrified by what they were seeing, others amazed. Some described them as UFOs. Others had no idea what they were seeing. Unknown to Jack, the radar operator, his entire conversation had also been recorded, and Michael Walsh was now listening to the incredible exchange between the police and the weather station. He realized now this wasn't just some CS reporting a UFO sighting. This was a serious story, and the newspaper ran it. Immediately, this quickly got back to Jack's bosses at the weather station. and they were not super impressed that they had been pulled into this story. He was told not to speak about the incident any further. The weather station quickly backtracked on what Jack had reported, claiming it could have some sort of natural explanation, but they couldn't say what that explanation would be. Meanwhile, Jack was being mocked by his colleagues who would fill the station up with paper plate UFOs. Numerous UFO investigators had descended on the area in the wake of the sightings, but Jack's superiors did not allow any of them to contact Jack. He was worried that as a scientist, he had now damaged his reputation, and one of his supervisors told him that it would be best if he left Michigan and started fresh somewhere else, which he did, ending up getting a job at the Weather Service in Atlanta until he retired in 2016. But this incident shook Jack to his very core and had a profound impact on his life. In 2021, he returned to Michigan and took it upon himself to talk to as many people who witnessed the events of that night as he could. He had been spurred on to do this after the leaks and admission of several high-profile UFO incidents by the US military. Multiple people that Jack spoke to remembered the incident, well, many of them referencing the same movements that Jack had witnessed on his radar and the incredible speed at which they had moved as well. Jack leered a very interesting story about a young couple who were camping not too far from where Jack had reported seeing the lights congregating in one area, and they had a story that had some interesting echoes to the boiling water phenomenon. They were camping by the lake when the wife was awoken by the sound of rushing water. She stepped out of the tent and couldn't believe what she was seeing over the lake far out on the water. There appeared to be a large light hovering in the sky. Underneath the light you could see what seemed to be a 20-t wide waterfall. But the water wasn't falling, it was traveling upwards towards the light. Terrified, the couple fled the scene. All in all, this is one of the most widely reported mass UFO sightings of all time. Over 300 witnesses came forward spanning 42 different Michigan counties, leaving investigators wondering if 300 people were willing to put themselves out there and actually report it. How many others saw it and didn't contact the police or the press? But why does so much of this phenomena happen around Lake Michigan? The easy answer is that such a large area is bound to have some strange stories associated with it. Maybe it is all just a coincidence, but others have pointed to a more recent discovery that may suggest that there is more to this location than meets the eye. In 2007, underwater archaeologist Dr. Mark Holley and his team discovered a series of rocks under the lake that appear to have been deliberately placed there around 9,000 years ago. Shockingly, small amounts of research have been done on these stones. Despite what many sources claim, the stones are not anything like the standing stones of Stonehenge and are instead a long line of smaller stones. They have been placed in a mile-long stretch along the lake bed. But many of the famous ancient stone locations around the world have been reported as being hotpots for accounts of high strangeness, and it's hard not to raise your eyebrows a little when you realize that these stones are in Grand Traverse Bay, where the reported boiling water phenomenon took place over 100 years ago. Why were these stones placed there? What was the significance of this location? That's all for this entry into the tape library. I'm not going to lie, I've had a lot of fun with this one. After quite a heavy topic, with the William Toomey mystery, I really enjoyed just getting to dive into nautical ghost stories and UFOs. This is the first time I've delved into a specific location and all the stories associated with it since the Hoya Baciu episode. I do really enjoy these ones, so if there are any other locations full of creepy stories you would like me to explore, then please do suggest them in the comments. Maybe once every couple of months, these can become a kind of tape library travel show. These were just a handful of the crazy stories associated with Lake Michigan. I ended up using quite a range of sources for this one, but if you're looking for a good overview of the topic, I strongly recommend Frederick Stonehouse's book, Haunted Lake Michigan. It was a huge help in putting this one together and features so many other little stories that I'm sure a lot of you will love it. Don't forget, if you enjoyed this episode, then please do click like if you are watching the videos. If you are listening to the podcast version and you haven't already, then leaving me a rating helps support the show massively, so there's nothing left to do but to thank the people who made this episode possible. Our tape library archivist, UMO Grim Tracy Terrell, Sandy Lusk Restock, 1731 Mirror, Judith Hacker, Gabrielle, Eric Salis Destiny Air Mar Books, Adeline Pet McCann, Georgia Harvey, Callio Deppy, Johnny Dominic The Angelus, D. J. Daily 1000th Ghost, London Grace Simon Ulas Callie Cop, Megan Reading Alfredo Sandoval Dara, and Queen of Flatlands, the lead archivist Vanel Brian Baker, Old Soul Like Mine, Lord William Xavier, Wrangle Tyler Michael Ridiculous, Melissa Harrington, Alex O'Neill, and Alex Goldberg, and our Grand Overseers for Revan Morning Rain 2619 KY Agent, 355 Brockhampton, and Grim Rhea, per KL. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and to all my junior archivists and YouTube members as well. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.